The sun shone brightly in the bustling city square, a place where people hurried by, going about their day. The air was filled with the sounds of busy conversations, the honking of cars, and the distant hum of the city. In the middle of it all, sitting alone on a worn-out bench, was an elderly black woman named Mrs. Jackson. Her back was slightly hunched. Her clothes were simple and faded, but there was a quiet dignity about her that could not be ignored. She sat with her hands folded neatly on her lap, her eyes calm and patient, as if she had seen it all before. As the hustle of the crowd continued, a group of young people came into view. Their laughter echoed through the square as they walked past Mrs. Jackson. The group was loud and full of energy, but their eyes quickly landed on the elderly woman sitting quietly on the bench. They paused, exchanging glances, before one of them, a tall, skinny teenager with a sharp grin, stepped forward. "Look at her," the boy sneered, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "What's an old lady like her doing here? Probably looking for her next meal." The others in the group chuckled at the comment, clearly amused. They gathered around Mrs. Jackson, their laughter growing louder. One of them, a girl with bright pink hair, reached out and nudged Mrs. Jackson's arm, as if to provoke her. "Hey, Granny, you lost or something?" she said mockingly. Mrs. Jackson didn't flinch. She didn't move a muscle. Her eyes remained fixed on the space ahead of her, calm and unfazed. The bullies didn't stop there. They took turns making cruel remarks, each one more cutting than the last. They called her names, mocked her clothes, and laughed at her wrinkles, as though her age and appearance gave them the right to treat her like a joke. But Mrs. Jackson did not respond. She remained seated, her hands still folded neatly in her lap. She seemed to be in a world of her own, untouched by the cruelty surrounding her. The group of young people grew bolder, thinking that their taunts had no consequences. They were in control, and they knew it. The boy with the sharp grin leaned in closer, his voice a little louder now. "What's the matter, old lady? Too scared to speak? You should be grateful we're even talking to you," he mocked. Mrs. Jackson's gaze flickered for just a moment, a small knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. She wasn't scared. She wasn't angry. She was simply watching them, taking in their behavior with a quiet understanding. She had lived long enough to know that cruelty often came from insecurity, and she saw no reason to engage with it. But then something strange happened. From across the square, a tall man in a baseball cap and sunglasses watched the scene unfold. He stood still, his eyes scanning the situation with careful attention. His gaze lingered not only on the group of young people who were mocking Mrs. Jackson, but also on the elderly woman herself. There was something about her that caught his attention. The man didn't move at first. He seemed out of place, like someone who didn't belong in the middle of this busy city square. His posture was relaxed, but there was an intensity in the way he observed the bullies. It was almost as if he could see something beyond their laughter, something more important than the cruelty they were displaying. As the group continued to laugh and jeer, the man's face remained unreadable. He didn't rush to intervene. He didn't act impulsively, but his presence in the square was undeniable. There was a quiet power in the way he stood there, observing, waiting. Mrs. Jackson, still sitting calmly on the bench, seemed to sense the change in the air. She didn't look toward the man, but something about the way the crowd reacted to him, shifting slightly, growing more aware, caught her attention. The bullies, sensing that something was different now, looked around nervously. For a brief moment, their confidence wavered. The tall man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on the group of young people, who stopped laughing and glanced at each other, unsure of what to make of him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The intensity in his gaze was enough. The bullies fell silent for a moment, exchanging unsure looks. They had been the loud ones, the ones in control, but now, there was something about the man that made them uneasy. One of the boys, the one who had mocked Mrs. Jackson the most, finally spoke. His voice was hesitant. "What do you want?" he asked, his bravado starting to slip. The man in the baseball cap didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, his eyes still locked on the group. His presence alone was enough to make the air feel heavier, more tense. For a brief moment, Mrs. Jackson allowed herself to glance toward the man. She didn't show surprise or fear. just a quiet recognition. As the bullies began to shuffle away, unsure of what to do next, the man remained where he was. His job wasn't to intervene yet, he was still observing. In that quiet moment, Mrs. Jackson knew something important was about to unfold. The game was changing. And as the group of bullies began to retreat, the man in the baseball cap took a step toward Mrs. Jackson. Something told her that this encounter was not going to be like the others. Something about him felt different. The air in the square felt heavier now, thick with the tension that had only moments ago been stirred by the bullies' laughter. The group of young people had slowly dispersed, their pride deflated, their earlier mockery fading into uncomfortable silence. But the elderly woman, Mrs. Jackson, remained seated on the same bench, as if nothing had happened. Her calm demeanor was as much a part of the scene as the sun overhead and the hum of the distant traffic. Across the square, the tall man in the baseball cap and sunglasses continued to stand still. He hadn't moved an inch, and neither had Mrs. Jackson. He was waiting, watching. There was something compelling about him, something that demanded attention. His presence was not the kind that shouted for recognition, but the kind that quietly commanded it. He wasn't just an observer, he was studying the situation, reading it as though it were a puzzle. The group of bullies, now scattered, walked away from the scene, each of them casting a glance back toward the bench where Mrs. Jackson sat. Their bravado was gone, replaced by uncertainty. The moment of victory they had felt just a minute ago was now replaced by something else, something like regret, or maybe fear. But none of them had the courage to look at Mrs. Jackson again. They were cowards at heart, and she had exposed that with nothing but her silence. Mrs. Jackson took a deep breath, her hands still folded neatly in her lap. She could feel the eyes of the tall man on her. She didn't know who he was, but she didn't need to. There was an air about him that made her believe he knew exactly what was happening in the square, and perhaps what would happen next. She waited patiently. In her long life, she had learned that timing was everything. She had learned that sometimes silence was the most powerful response. And today, her patience would be tested. The man in the baseball cap slowly began walking towards her. His steps were measured, calm. As he neared the bench, he gave a slight nod, acknowledging her presence without saying a word. Mrs. Jackson nodded back, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Finally, he spoke. "Are you okay?" His voice was deep, warm, but there was an edge of concern in it, as though he was asking not out of politeness, but because he genuinely wanted to know. Mrs. Jackson looked up at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I'm fine," she replied simply. Her voice was steady, but there was an underlying strength in it, as if she had weathered storms far worse than what had just happened. The man tilted his head, his eyes scanning her face, taking in the calmness that radiated from her. "Those kids didn't know who they were messing with, did they?" he said, his words more to himself than to her. Mrs. Jackson didn't respond immediately. She let his words hang in the air for a moment before giving him a small smile. "People never do," she said quietly. For a moment, the man just stood there, considering her words. Then, without another word, he slowly sat down next to her on the bench. The city square seemed to fall silent for just a moment, as if the world itself was waiting for what would happen next. "You don't mind me sitting here, do you?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. It was more of a statement, as if he had already decided he would stay. Mrs. Jackson's smile widened slightly, but she said nothing. Instead, she simply looked out at the square, watching the world go by. The man followed her gaze, his eyes drifting over the busy crowd, the noise, the activity. But it was clear that his mind was elsewhere, on something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. "You know," the man continued, his voice low, "sometimes people think they can pick on others because they're weak. But they're wrong. People like you, people who've lived as long as you have, they've got something that others can't even see." Mrs. Jackson looked at him again, a small flicker of interest in her eyes. "And what's that?" she asked, her voice curious but still calm. He hesitated for a moment, then looked directly into her eyes, his expression serious. "Strength," he said simply. "True strength doesn't shout. It's quiet. It's the kind that lasts." Mrs. Jackson chuckled softly. That's the kind of strength that's often overlooked. The man nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. Exactly. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The minutes seemed to stretch, as though the world had stopped just for a moment. There was no need for words. The connection between them was silent, unspoken. The man wasn't just talking about strength, he was talking about understanding. And in that moment, Mrs. Jackson felt understood. Just then, a small voice broke the silence. "Are you gonna let them get away with that?" a voice asked from behind them. Both of them turned to see a young boy, maybe no more than 10, standing a few feet away. His wide eyes were filled with curiosity, and there was a look of determination on his face. "Those kids were so mean to you. Are you just gonna let them go?" The man stood up slowly, towering over the boy, and then glanced at Mrs. Jackson. She met his gaze and gave him a small nod. This was the moment. Without a word, he walked away from the bench, his steps purposeful. Mrs. Jackson followed his movements for a moment, but as she did, something shifted in the air. The quiet dignity that had surrounded her now felt like it had been shared with the man in the baseball cap. The man in the baseball cap moved with an effortless confidence. He was no longer just a bystander in this quiet city square. His purpose was clear now. He had witnessed the cruelty that had been aimed at Mrs. Jackson, and he wasn't going to let it slide. The bullies had underestimated the wrong person, and now they were going to learn a hard lesson. He made his way to the group of young people who had mocked Mrs. Jackson just moments earlier. They were gathered near the fountain, laughing and joking among themselves, completely unaware that their actions had consequences. But their carefree chatter suddenly stopped when the man appeared in front of them, blocking their path. They looked up, confused. Then recognition hit them. The tall, muscular figure, the calm demeanor, the way he moved. This man wasn't just anyone. But before they could react, he spoke. "Is this how you treat people in your city? Picking on someone who's too old to fight back?" His voice was steady, cold even, but there was something behind it that made the group uneasy. The leader of the group, a tall young man with a cocky smirk, stepped forward. "What do you want, old man?" "This is none of your business." The man didn't flinch. It's everyone's business when someone thinks they can bully someone weaker than them. The young man laughed, but it wasn't a genuine laugh. It was nervous, like he was trying to cover up his discomfort. "And what? You gonna fight us?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached up and slowly pulled off his baseball cap and sunglasses. The transformation was immediate. The young people stared in shock as they realized who was standing in front of them. The man wasn't just some stranger in the square. He was someone they recognized from TV, from movies. He was a star, but not just any star. This man was Vin Diesel. The leader of the group stepped back, his eyes wide. "Wait, you're him? The action movie guy?" Vin Diesel's face was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes now. "I don't need to be on TV for you to understand how wrong you are. What you did today was ugly. You mocked someone who didn't deserve it, and you thought no one would call you out. Well, I'm calling you out." The group of bullies stood frozen, their bravado disappearing as they realized the gravity of the situation. They had just mocked a frail old woman in front of one of the most famous people on the planet. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Vin took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "What do you think makes you so special?" he asked, his tone stern. "You think you're better than someone because they're older or weaker. What if I told you that the strength you think you have doesn't even compare to what Mrs. Jackson has in her quiet dignity?" The leader of the group stammered. "We didn't mean, we were just joking." Vin raised an eyebrow. "Joking? Let's see how funny it is when the tables are turned." Just then, the young boy who had asked earlier if they were going to get away with it stepped forward again. He was small, but his voice was filled with a resolve that didn't match his size. "That's right. You should be ashamed of yourselves." Vin looked at the boy with a small smile, his expression softening. "You're absolutely right, kid." He turned back to the group of bullies. "So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to give you one chance to make things right. You're going to apologize to Mrs. Jackson, right here, right now." The bullies exchanged uneasy glances. They were clearly nervous, unsure of how to handle the situation now that they were face to face with Vin Diesel. They had been so confident before, but now they were beginning to feel the weight of their actions. They had underestimated this quiet city, this elderly woman, and most of all, Vin Diesel. The leader of the group hesitated for a moment, his pride holding him back. But then, with a deep sigh, he stepped forward. He looked at Mrs. Jackson, still sitting calmly on the bench, her gaze unwavering. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't mean it." The others followed suit, their apologies awkward but sincere. They had no choice but to apologize now that their hero was watching them. But Mrs. Jackson simply nodded, her calm smile never wavering. "It's good to see you finally realize your mistake," she said softly, her voice carrying more weight than any harsh words could. "But remember, actions speak louder than words." Vin Diesel stepped forward once more, this time his expression softer. "Apologies are just the first step," he said. "Now you need to make sure you never treat anyone like this again." The group of young people nodded, their faces reddened with shame. They had learned their lesson the hard way. They would never forget this moment, and they would never forget Mrs. Jackson's quiet strength or Vin Diesel's unexpected intervention. As they turned to leave, Vin Diesel glanced back at Mrs. Jackson. "You've got more strength than they'll ever understand," he said quietly. She smiled, her eyes gleaming with quiet wisdom. "It's not about strength, Mr. Diesel. It's about knowing when to stand tall and when to stay quiet." After the group of bullies had walked away, heads down and humiliated, Vin Diesel stood next to Mrs. Jackson, who had not moved an inch from her bench. The square was quiet now, the bustling sounds of the city fading into the background as the tension of the moment dissolved. Vin didn't say anything at first, simply standing there, allowing the atmosphere to settle. It was as though the city had taken a collective breath, holding its stillness. Mrs. Jackson, however, continued to sit calmly, as though nothing had happened. Finally, Vin turned to her. "You handled that better than anyone I've ever seen," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "Those kids will never forget you." Mrs. Jackson smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "They'll forget eventually. But it's not about them remembering. It's about teaching them something they might not get anywhere else." Vin raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "Respect," she said simply. "It's not just about being kind to those you know, but also to those you don't. Everyone deserves respect, no matter their age, their color, or how they look on the outside." Vine looked at her, studying her face. Her features were lined with age, but there was a sharpness in her eyes, a wisdom that transcended the years she'd lived. She had seen a lot in her life, and it was clear she wasn't the type to let others' opinions dictate her sense of self. "Do you think they learned anything today?" he asked, genuinely curious. Mrs. Jackson took a moment to reflect before answering. "Some might. Some will just chalk it up to getting embarrassed. But there's one thing I know for sure. Their actions weren't just about me. They were about how they view themselves. They need to understand their own worth before they can truly respect others." Vine smiled faintly. "You're right. Sometimes, people need to see themselves in a different light before they understand how they affect the world." The two of them stood there in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the city continue on around them. The noise and chaos of the square had returned, but the strange little bubble that had formed around them seemed to remain untouched by the hustle. Vin turned to look at her again. "You're not just some frail old woman," he said, almost as if to himself. You're something else." Mrs. Jackson chuckled softly, a sound as light as wind chimes. "I'm just me, Mr. Diesel. No more, no less. But there's strength in you," he persisted, shaking his head. "A kind of strength most people wouldn't recognize, because it's not loud or obvious." She met his gaze, her eyes twinkling with an understanding that only came from a lifetime of experience. Strength doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes, the strongest people are the quietest. It's about holding on to your dignity, your values, and knowing when to speak up, and when to let silence speak for you. Vin took a step back, clearly impressed. He had met many strong individuals in his career, but there was something unique about Mrs. Jackson. Something that went beyond physical strength. beyond what people usually associated with power. Her strength was her ability to stay calm, her refusal to let cruelty affect her, and her quiet defiance in the face of disrespect. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the square, Vine felt a shift within himself. He had been in countless high-octane action scenes, faced villains, and fought for justice. But in that moment, he realized something important. The real heroes weren't always the ones in the spotlight, fighting the bad guys with their fists. Sometimes, the real heroes were the ones who quietly held their ground, who showed others what true respect looked like. Mrs. Jackson stood up from the bench, slowly but steadily, using the cane that rested beside her. She looked at Vin with a knowing smile. "I'm not here to change the world, Mr. Diesel. But if I can teach just one person to think before they act, then I've done my job." Vin nodded in understanding. "You've done more than that today. You've shown them the power of grace." As they walked together through the square, Vin couldn't help but feel that he had just witnessed something rare, something worth remembering. In a world that often rushed to judgment, Mrs. Jackson had shown him that the real strength came from patience, from understanding, and from the ability to rise above the noise. The following day, Vin Diesel found himself back in the city square. He had been thinking about Mrs. Jackson all night, the words she had shared with him, and the way she had faced the bullies without flinching. Something about her strength had stuck with him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than met the eye. Vine stood across the street from the square, watching as people went about their business, oblivious to the events that had unfolded there just a day before. He had come to meet her again, but this time, he wasn't sure what to expect. Mrs. Jackson had already taught him so much, and yet he felt there was something deeper waiting to be revealed. After a few moments, he saw her approach the square, walking slowly but with purpose, just as she had the day before. Her cane tapped rhythmically on the pavement as she made her way toward the same bench where they had spoken. But this time something was different. There was a quiet determination in her steps, a sense of purpose that made Vin curious. He crossed the street, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of excitement and anticipation. As he reached her, she stopped and turned to face him, offering a gentle smile. "Mr. Diesel," she said, her voice warm and calm, yet laced with something deeper. "I knew you'd return." Vin raised an eyebrow, surprised. "How did you know?" "I could see it in your eyes yesterday," she replied, her gaze piercing. "You didn't just come to stand up for me. You came because you knew there was more to this than just a group of kids making fun of an old woman. You came because you're searching for something." Vin was taken aback. How did she know that? He had never said a word about his own struggles, his own search for meaning. But there was no denying that she was right. Something had drawn him to her, something he couldn't put into words. "Mrs. Jackson," Vin began, but she raised a hand, stopping him. "I know you've been through a lot," she said, her voice softening. "I know you've fought in battles, faced danger, and done things most people can't even imagine. But I also know that there's a part of you that wonders if there's something more, something deeper." Vine stared at her, speechless. She was right. All his life, he had fought for the right causes, had been a hero on the screen, but deep down, he'd always wondered if there was something more to life than just fame and glory. He had never fully found peace within himself. Mrs. Jackson sat down on the bench, motioning for him to join her. He did, sitting next to her in silence for a moment. Then she spoke again. "The world is full of noise, Mr. Diesel. People shouting for attention, fighting for power, trying to make a name for themselves. But the real power, the kind that lasts, isn't about being loud or famous. It's about the quiet strength of people like me, who have lived through hardships and found peace in knowing who they are." Vine listened intently, absorbing every word. There was something about her calm presence, her ability to speak with such certainty, that made him feel at ease. In her, he saw the kind of strength that didn't need to be proved to anyone. It was just there, steady and unshakable. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tired of being strong?" Mrs. Jackson chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Being strong isn't a burden, Mr. Diesel. It's a gift. And strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about knowing that no matter how hard life gets, You can bend without snapping. You can keep going, even when the world wants to push you down. Vin was quiet for a moment, taking it all in. There was so much wisdom in her words, so much clarity. He had spent his life running at full speed, fighting battles and facing challenges head-on, but he had never truly learned the kind of strength Mrs. Jackson was talking about. He had never stopped to reflect, to understand the true meaning of resilience. "I've been running for a long time," Vin said softly, looking down at the ground. "I think I've been running from something. Maybe from myself." Mrs. Jackson looked at him, her expression gentle yet piercing. "It's never too late to stop running, Mr. Diesel. The answers you're looking for aren't out there in the world. They're inside of you." For a long time, they sat there in silence, the city buzzing around them. But inside the small bubble of that moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Vine realized something important then. Mrs. Jackson wasn't just teaching him about strength. She was teaching him about peace, about how to be still in a world that never stopped moving. The next day, the city square was bustling as usual. People hurried past, caught up in their daily routines, oblivious to the profound moment that had just taken place the day before. But for Vin Diesel, everything had changed. He had spent the entire night reflecting on Mrs. Jackson's words. Her wisdom had touched him in a way nothing else had before. It was as if he had spent his whole life chasing after the wrong things, always searching for answers in the chaos of the world. But now, thanks to Mrs. Jackson, he understood that the true answers came from within. It was about stillness, about knowing who you truly are. But as much as he had learned, there was still something unfinished. He knew he had to do something more, something that would honor the strength and dignity that Mrs. Jackson had shown him. Vine made his way to the square once again, his heart heavy with purpose. As he arrived, he saw Mrs. Jackson sitting on the same bench, her cane resting beside her. She was looking out at the horizon, her eyes calm, as if she had been waiting for him. He walked up to her, his face serious, but with a quiet determination. Mrs. Jackson turned her head and smiled warmly. "Mr. Diesel," she said, her voice gentle, "I knew you'd come back. I can feel when something important is about to happen." Vine nodded, taking a seat beside her. The weight of the world seemed to lift off his shoulders as he sat next to this wise woman who had taught him more than any movie or fame ever could. "I've been thinking a lot," Vin said, his voice low. "You've shown me what true strength is, Mrs. Jackson. It's not about fighting battles or being tough. It's about being calm in the storm, knowing who you are, and standing firm no matter what. And I've been running from that for too long." Mrs. Jackson's eyes softened. "It's never too late to stop running. But you must understand, the strength you seek isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about peace. Real power comes from peace." Vine let out a breath, the weight of her words settling in. For the first time, he realized that the world didn't need him to be a hero in the way he had always imagined. He didn't need to be loud or powerful or even famous. He just needed to be himself. As they sat there in the quiet, a few people passed by, their eyes lingering on Vin. Some whispered in shock, recognizing him, but he didn't mind. For once, he wasn't bothered by the attention. He wasn't looking for validation. He had everything he needed right here, in this moment. "How did you come to understand all of this?" Vin asked. "How did you know to stay so calm?" Mrs. Jackson chuckled softly. "I've lived through more than you can imagine, Mr. Diesel. There were times when the world wanted to break me, when everything seemed impossible. But every time, I found strength in silence, in knowing that the only thing I could control was how I reacted. The world doesn't dictate who we are, Mr. Diesel. We do." Vine stared at her, amazed by the depth of her words. Mrs. Jackson wasn't just a survivor of the world's hardships. She was a master of self-mastery. She had learned that true power lay not in the outside world, but in the ability to stay grounded within yourself. "I want to help you," Vin said, suddenly realizing the importance of what he could give back. "I want to share your story, help others understand what real strength is, just like you helped me understand it." Mrs. Jackson smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. "The world is full of noise, Mr. Diesel, but sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen to the quiet. Share the stories of the people who have lived through the storms, and you'll change the world in ways you never imagined. Vin stood up, extending a hand to Mrs. Jackson. Thank you for everything. She took his hand, her grip firm yet kind. It's not me you need to thank, it's yourself. You're the one who finally stopped running. As Vin Diesel walked away from the square that day, something inside him had shifted. He was no longer the man who had always sought fame and recognition. He was someone new, someone who had found peace within himself. He knew now that true power wasn't about being in the spotlight. It was about having the courage to be quiet, to stand firm in who you are, and to offer that strength to others. And so, the story of Mrs. Jackson would not end in the city square. It would echo in the lives of countless others who would hear her words, find peace in her strength, and like Vin, learn to stop running. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, Vin knew he had found the one thing that could never be taken away from him: peace.